In the heart of Blackwood, where the shadows whisper secrets long buried and the forest itself seems to breathe with malevolence, an ancient power stirs, one that has waited centuries to reclaim its dark dominion. As the night deepens and the townsfolk feel the icy grip of dread, a single soul steps forward, drawn to the decaying manor at the edge of town. What begins as an unsettling presence soon unravels into a battle between light and darkness, where the very fate of Blackwood teeters on the edge of oblivion. Chapter 1. The Gathering of Shadows. The town of Blackwood, nestled deep within a sprawling forest, was a place shrouded in secrecy. Ancient trees towered over the narrow, winding roads, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out the sun, even on the brightest of days. The air was always thick with a heavy, almost oppressive stillness, as if the forest itself held its breath, waiting for something long forgotten to awaken. At the heart of this secluded town stood the Blackwood Manor, a crumbling relic of a bygone era. The manor had stood for centuries, its once grand facade now marred by the passage of time. Ivy clung to the weathered stone walls, creeping up toward the broken windows that stared out like hollow eyes. The front gates, rusted and twisted, groaned under the weight of years, opening to a pathway overgrown with weeds. Few dared to venture near the manor, for it was said that those who did rarely returned. It was on a moonless night, when the sky was a vast, starless void, that the shadows began to gather. The winds, usually calm, started to howl through the trees, carrying with them an unsettling chill that seeped into the bones of anyone caught outside. As the hours passed, the darkness around Blackwood Manor deepened, taking on an unnatural quality, as if the shadows themselves were alive, writhing and pulsing with malevolent intent. Within the manor, the air grew thick with the scent of decay. The once pristine hallways were now lined with dust, and the portraits that hung on the walls seemed to shift and move in the flickering candlelight. In the center of the grand foyer, a massive chandelier, its crystals dulled by years of neglect, swayed gently, casting eerie reflections across the room. At the far end of the foyer, a grand staircase led up to the second floor, its wooden steps creaking under the weight of an unseen presence. It was here that the shadows began to coalesce, pooling together to form a dark mass that slowly began to take shape. From the darkness emerged a figure, tall and imposing, draped in tattered robes that trailed behind it like a cloak of night. The figure's face was hidden beneath a hood, but its eyes, burning with an unnatural light, pierced through the darkness, surveying the manor with a gaze that seemed to see into the very soul of the building. This figure was known only as the Shadow Priest, a being of immense power that had been summoned from the depths of the abyss. Its purpose was unclear, but its presence alone was enough to send waves of fear rippling through the town. The Shadow Priest moved silently through the manor, its footsteps echoing through the empty halls. It made its way to the old chapel, hidden deep within the bowels of the manor, where it began to prepare for the ritual that would soon take place. Meanwhile, across town, the people of Blackwood began to feel a growing sense of dread. The air seemed to hum with a strange energy, and the animals, usually quiet and reserved, began to act erratically. Dogs barked at unseen threats, and birds took flight in panic, their calls piercing the night. In their homes, the townsfolk locked their doors and drew their curtains, whispering prayers to ward off the evil they could sense lurking just beyond the edge of the forest. Among them was Evelyn, a young woman with a deep connection to the town's history. Her family had lived in Blackwood for generations, and she had always felt a strange pull toward the old manor. Tonight, however, that pull was stronger than ever. As she stood at the window of her small cottage, staring out into the night, she felt a chill run down her spine. Something was coming, something dark and terrible, and she knew that it was up to her to stop it. Evelyn hurriedly gathered a small bag of supplies. Candles, a vial of holy water, and a silver dagger passed down through her family and set off toward Blackwood Manor. The forest seemed to close in around her as she made her way through the narrow paths, the trees towering over her like silent sentinels. The wind howled through the branches, carrying with it whispers of ancient curses and forgotten secrets. As she approached the manor, Evelyn could feel the weight of the shadows pressing down on her, sapping her strength and filling her mind with doubt. But she pushed on, driven by a force she couldn't fully understand. The gates creaked open as she approached, and she stepped onto the overgrown path that led to the front door. Inside the manor, the shadow priest continued its preparations. Candles were lit, casting a dim, flickering light over the ancient altar that stood at the center of the chapel. The walls were adorned with symbols of dark magic, and the air was thick with the scent of burning incense. The ritual was about to begin, and once it did, there would be no turning back. As Evelyn entered the manor, she was immediately struck by the oppressive darkness that filled the space. The air was cold, and every breath felt like it was being drawn through a veil of shadows. She made her way cautiously through the grand foyer, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The chandelier above her swayed gently, casting strange shadows across the room, and she could feel the eyes of the portraits following her as she passed. The pull toward the chapel was strong, almost overwhelming, and Evelyn found herself moving toward it as if guided by an unseen hand. She reached the door to the chapel, her heart pounding in her chest. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scene before her was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The shadow priest stood at the altar, its dark form towering over the room. The candles flickered wildly, casting strange, dancing shadows across the walls, and the symbols of dark magic seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Evelyn could feel the power emanating from the altar, a power that threatened to consume her if she let it. But Evelyn was not afraid. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life, and she knew that she held the key to stopping the ritual before it was too late. With steady hands, she placed the candles in a circle around her and began to chant an ancient incantation passed down through her family. The air around her began to hum with energy, and the shadows that filled the room seemed to recoil at her words. The shadow priest turned its burning gaze toward Evelyn, its eyes narrowing as it recognized the threat she posed. It raised its arms, summoning the full force of the darkness that surrounded them. The shadows surged forward, converging on Evelyn, but she stood her ground, continuing to chant the incantation with unwavering determination. The battle between light and darkness raged within the chapel, the very air crackling with energy. The shadows twisted and writhed, trying to break through the barrier Evelyn had created, but she held firm, drawing on the strength of her ancestors to fuel her power. Slowly, the darkness began to recede, and the light from the candles grew brighter, pushing back the shadows and weakening the shadow priest's hold on the manor. Finally, with one last surge of energy, Evelyn completed the incantation. The room was flooded with light, and the shadows were banished to the corners of the chapel, leaving the shadow priest weakened and vulnerable. Evelyn stepped forward, the silver dagger in hand, and with a swift, decisive strike, she plunged the blade into the heart of the shadow priest. The creature let out a soundless scream, its form disintegrating into a cloud of black smoke that was quickly consumed by the light. The candles flickered once more before going out, leaving the chapel in complete darkness. Evelyn stood alone in the silent chapel, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The battle was over, but she knew that the victory had come at a great cost. The darkness that had plagued Blackwood for centuries had been driven back, but it was not gone. It would return, and when it did, Evelyn would be ready. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Abyss. Blackwood was a town haunted by its past, its streets lined with the weight of countless secrets. The forest that surrounded it seemed to hold time itself at bay, trapping the town in a perpetual twilight. The events of that fateful night, when Evelyn faced the shadow priest in the manor's chapel, left a lasting scar on the land, one that festered and grew with each passing day. Despite Evelyn's victory, the darkness had not been entirely vanquished. The air around Blackwood felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere had absorbed the lingering malevolence of the ritual. The townsfolk, though unaware of the true events that had transpired, sensed a change. They spoke in hushed tones of strange occurrences, of whispers carried on the wind, of fleeting shadows seen from the corners of their eyes. Animals continued to act erratically, and the once tranquil nights were now punctuated by the distant, mournful howls of unseen creatures. Evelyn herself had not emerged from the battle unscathed. Though she had banished the shadow priest, the encounter had left her weakened, both physically and spiritually. She returned to her cottage on the outskirts of town, her steps slow and labored. The familiar surroundings of her home, once a sanctuary, now felt alien and foreboding. The warmth of the hearth did little to chase away the chill that clung to her bones. She spent her days in solitude, her mind plagued by the echoes of that night. The vision of the shadow priest, its burning eyes and the consuming darkness, replayed endlessly in her thoughts. Each time she closed her eyes, she was transported back to the manor, to the chapel where the battle had taken place. She could feel the shadows pressing in on her, suffocating her, as if they were determined to pull her back into the abyss. Evelyn knew that the battle was far from over. The darkness that had been unleashed would not be so easily contained. The shadow priest was only the beginning. There were other forces at play, older and more powerful, that had yet to reveal themselves. The ritual had been interrupted, but it had not been stopped. Whatever the shadow priest had been trying to summon was still out there, waiting for the moment when it could fully manifest in the world. One night, as Evelyn sat by the fire, she felt a familiar tug, the same force that had drawn her to Blackwood Manor before. This time, however, it was not the manor that called to her, but the forest itself. The trees, ancient and gnarled, seemed to whisper her name, beckoning her to venture deeper into their midst. It was a call she could not ignore, for she knew that the answers she sought lay within the heart of the woods. Evelyn gathered her supplies once more, though this time with a sense of grim determination. She strapped the silver dagger to her belt and placed the vial of holy water in her pocket. With a final glance around her cottage, she stepped out into the night, the door closing behind her with a soft click. The forest was a different world at night. The trees loomed tall and imposing, their branches interlocking to form a dense canopy that blocked out the sky. The path ahead was narrow and winding, barely visible in the faint light of the crescent moon. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. Evelyn's footsteps were quiet, but each one echoed through the stillness like a drumbeat, as if the forest itself was aware of her presence. The deeper she ventured, the more the atmosphere around her seemed to change. The air grew colder, and the shadows lengthened, twisting and contorting into strange, unnatural shapes. The trees, once familiar, now seemed to move and shift, as if alive and watching her every move. As she walked, Evelyn became aware of a low, distant hum that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath her feet. The sound was barely perceptible at first, but it grew louder the further she went, until it was a constant thrumming in her ears. It was a sound that resonated deep within her, vibrating through her bones and rattling her teeth. It was as if the earth itself was alive, its heart beating in time with the dark forces that lay hidden beneath its surface. The path led Evelyn to a clearing in the heart of the forest, a place that seemed untouched by time. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and twisted, their roots tangled and knotted like the veins of some ancient beast. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, weathered and covered in moss, its surface etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. The altar was surrounded by a ring of stones, each one inscribed with runes that pulsed with an eerie, otherworldly light. Evelyn approached the altar with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The air around it crackled with energy, a palpable force that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She could feel the power emanating from the stones, a a power that was both ancient and malevolent. It was as if the very ground beneath the altar was a gateway, a portal to some dark realm beyond the physical world. As she stood before the altar, the humming grew louder, filling her ears with a cacophony of sound. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, the earth shifting and groaning as if something deep below was trying to break free. The runes on the stones glowed brighter, their light pulsating in time with the rhythm of the earth. The shadows around the clearing seemed to come alive, swirling and twisting in the air like a black mist. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what was happening. The ritual had not been completed, but the dark forces that had been summoned were still trying to break through. The Shadow Priest may have been defeated, but the power it had called upon remained, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Without hesitation, Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out the vial of holy water. She knew that she had to act quickly before the forces at play could fully manifest. With steady hands, she poured the water over the altar, watching as the liquid sizzled and evaporated upon contact with the stone. The runes flared brightly, then dimmed, their light flickering like a dying flame. The ground shook violently, and a deep, rumbling growl emanated from the earth below. Evelyn stumbled backward, her eyes fixed on the altar as the shadows around it thickened and coalesced into a single, towering form. It was a figure of pure darkness, its shape indistinct but menacing, its presence radiating a sense of overwhelming dread. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The figure loomed over the altar, its shadow stretching out across the clearing like a dark stain. Evelyn could feel its gaze upon her, cold and unyielding, as if it was assessing her, judging her worthiness to stand before it. The weight of its presence pressed down on her, threatening to crush her under its immense power. But Evelyn did not falter. She knew that this was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment that would determine the fate of Blackwood. With a surge of resolve, she gripped the silver dagger and stepped forward, her eyes locked on the figure of darkness. As she raised the dagger, the figure let out a soundless roar, its form expanding and contracting as it tried to resist her. The ground beneath her feet cracked and splintered, and the air was filled with the deafening roar of the earth splitting apart. But Evelyn pressed on, her determination unshakable. With a final, decisive strike, she drove the dagger into the heart of the altar, releasing a wave of light that burst forth and engulfed the entire clearing. The figure of darkness let out a final, agonized wail as it was consumed by the light, its form dissolving into nothingness. The runes on the stones flickered and died, their light extinguished, and the ground beneath the altar fell silent once more. Evelyn stood alone in the clearing, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The air was still, and the shadows had receded, leaving the forest bathed in the pale light of the crescent moon. The altar, once a source of dark power, was now nothing more than a lifeless stone, its surface cold and unyielding. The battle was over, but Evelyn knew that the war was far from won. The darkness that had plagued Blackwood for centuries had been driven back, but it was not gone. It lingered on the edges of reality, waiting for the moment when it could strike again. Evelyn turned and made her way back through the forest, her mind heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. The town of Blackwood had been saved, for now, but the shadows were always watching, always waiting. And when they returned, Evelyn would be ready to face them once more. Chapter 3: The Unseen Terror. The town of Blackwood slowly returned to its uneasy routine, but the air remained thick with an unnamed fear. The battle against the Shadow Priest had become nothing more than a murmur among the townsfolk, a vague memory that everyone avoided discussing. Yet, Evelyn knew better. She could feel the darkness lingering, a quiet but ever-present threat that loomed over Blackwood. Evelyn's days passed in a haze, the weight of her recent battle pressing down on her spirit. She wandered through the town, her presence a ghostly reminder of the events that had shaken the community. The streets of Blackwood, once bustling with life, seemed eerily quiet now. The townspeople went about their daily tasks with downcast eyes, their steps hurried as if they wished to avoid the unknown that seemed to lurk just out of sight. The children no longer played in the open fields or by the edge of the forest. Even the birds, once so vibrant with song, had fallen silent, as if sensing the unease that permeated the town. The wind, when it blew through the narrow streets, carried with it a strange, mournful sound, a distant wail that seemed to echo from the very heart of the forest. Evelyn's thoughts were consumed by the altar in the clearing, the vision of the shadowy figure etched into her mind. She had defeated it, but the feeling of unfinished business gnawed at her. The darkness was not gone. It had merely retreated, waiting for another opportunity to strike. And Evelyn knew that when it did, it would be more powerful, more insidious than before. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast the town in a deep, crimson glow, Evelyn found herself drawn to the outskirts of Blackwood once more. The forest called to her, its ancient trees whispering secrets that only she could hear. She felt a pull, a compulsion to return to the heart of the woods, to the place where the battle had been fought. Evelyn's footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path as she made her way toward the edge of the forest. The trees stood tall and imposing, their branches interwoven to create a canopy that blotted out the last rays of sunlight. The forest floor was littered with fallen leaves, their dry, brittle edges rustling with every movement. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. As she entered the forest, Evelyn was struck by the stillness that surrounded her. It was as if the very life of the forest had been drained away, leaving behind only shadows and silence. The path ahead was barely visible, the undergrowth thick and tangled, but Evelyn pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency that she could not fully understand. The deeper she ventured into the woods, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The trees, once familiar, now appeared twisted and grotesque, their trunks gnarled and their branches claw-like as they reached toward the sky. The shadows between them seemed to move on their own, shifting and writhing like living things. The ground beneath Evelyn's feet felt unstable, as if the earth itself was rebelling against her presence. Evelyn's pace quickened as she approached the clearing. The memory of the altar, of the shadowy figure, loomed large in her mind, and she knew that she had to confront whatever remained there. But as she neared the edge of the clearing, she noticed something strange. The air around her grew colder, and the oppressive silence was broken by a faint, rhythmic thudding. It was a sound that was both familiar and foreign, a deep, resonant noise that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Evelyn paused, her breath catching in her throat as she strained to identify the source of the sound. It was unlike anything she had ever heard before, a steady, deliberate beat that grew louder with each passing second. Evelyn moved cautiously toward the clearing, her senses heightened, every fiber of her being alert to the slightest movement. As she stepped into the open space, she was greeted by a sight that sent a chill down her spine. The altar stood as it had before, but something was different. The stone surface was no longer cold and lifeless. It pulsed with a faint, eerie glow, as if something deep within was trying to break free. The ground around the altar had changed as well. Where there had once been a ring of stones, now there were deep, jagged cracks that radiated outward from the center. The earth was split, as if something had torn its way up from the depths below. The thudding sound was louder here, reverberating through the ground and up into Evelyn's bones. Evelyn approached the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. The glow intensified as she drew near, casting an unnatural light across the clearing. The cracks in the earth seemed to pulse in time with the sound, a rhythmic beat that resonated through the air. The power that had been contained within the altar was still there, but now it was different, stronger, more malevolent. Evelyn knelt beside the altar, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the cold stone. The moment her fingers made contact, a shock of energy surged through her, causing her to gasp and pull back. The light flared brightly, and the ground beneath her shook with violent force. It was as if the forest itself was rebelling, trying to expel her from its depths. But Evelyn did not retreat. She knew that she had to confront whatever force was at work here, no matter the cost. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and reached into her bag for the silver dagger. The blade gleamed in the dim light, its surface unmarred by the previous battle. Evelyn gripped the handle tightly, her resolve firm as she prepared to drive the dagger into the heart of the altar once more. Before she could strike, the ground erupted with a deafening roar. The cracks widened, and the earth split apart, sending chunks of rock and dirt flying into the air. Evelyn staggered back, her eyes wide as she watched in horror as something began to emerge from the depths below. A dark, swirling mass of shadow and smoke rose from the earth, its form indistinct but terrifying. It was as if the darkness itself had taken on a life of its own, coalescing into a monstrous shape that defied description. The air around it crackled with energy, and the rhythmic thudding grew louder, faster, until it was a deafening drumbeat that echoed through the entire forest. Evelyn's heart raced as she faced the monstrous entity, her mind reeling with the realization that this was something far beyond her understanding. The darkness that had been summoned by the Shadow Priest was nothing compared to this, a force so ancient and powerful that it defied all logic, all reason. The entity moved toward her, its form shifting and writhing like a living nightmare. Evelyn could feel its presence pressing down on her, suffocating her with its sheer power. The ground shook beneath her feet, and the trees around the clearing bent and twisted as if they were being pulled toward the entity by some unseen force. Evelyn knew that she had to act quickly. With a cry of determination, she raised the silver dagger and lunged forward, driving the blade into the heart of the shadowy mass. The moment the dagger made contact, the entity let out a soundless scream, its form writhing and contorting as it tried to escape the blade's piercing light. The light from the dagger spread rapidly, engulfing the entity in a blinding flash of brilliance. The ground beneath Evelyn's feet trembled violently, and the air was filled with the deafening roar of the earth splitting apart. The entity thrashed and twisted, its form dissolving into nothingness as the light consumed it. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos subsided. The ground stopped shaking, the air grew still, and the light from the dagger faded into darkness. The entity was gone, its presence erased from the world, and the clearing was once again silent. Evelyn stood alone in the clearing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The altar was shattered, the stones broken and scattered across the ground. The cracks in the earth had closed, leaving only a faint scar in the earth. The forest around her was eerily quiet, as if the battle had drained the life from everything within it. Evelyn lowered the dagger, her hands trembling with exhaustion. She had faced the darkness and won, but at what cost? The entity was gone, but the damage it had wrought was clear. The forest would never be the same, and neither would she. As she made her way back through the woods, Evelyn could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her. She had defeated the entity, but the darkness had left its mark on her soul. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. The shadows would return, and when they did, Evelyn would be ready to face them once more, no matter the cost. Chapter 4. The Haunting Silence. Blackwood returned to its usual rhythms, but something had changed. The town seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something unseen, something inevitable. The streets, once filled with the everyday noise of life, now carried an eerie silence. Conversations became hushed, glances wary, and even the wind seemed to move cautiously through the trees. Blackwood had always been a place of quiet resilience, but now that quietness had taken on a darker, more sinister tone. Evelyn, however, couldn't shake the feeling that the battle she'd fought had only been the beginning. The entity she had faced in the forest, that dark, swirling mass of shadow, was gone, but its presence lingered in the corners of her mind, in the hidden spaces of the town. The forest, once a place of mystery and life, now felt like a graveyard, a place where something terrible had been buried but not fully laid to rest. The days passed slowly. Evelyn went about her routines, but everything felt hollow. Her small house on the edge of Blackwood was a sanctuary of sorts, but even there, she couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. At night, she would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence that pressed in from all sides. It was as if the darkness outside was trying to seep in through the walls, to claim her as it had tried to claim the forest. One particularly cold morning, Evelyn decided to walk through the town. The air was crisp, and a thin layer of frost coated the ground. She pulled her coat tightly around her, feeling the chill seep into her bones. The streets were empty, the usual morning activity subdued. A few townsfolk hurried by, their faces hidden behind scarves and hats, their eyes avoiding Evelyn's as they passed. She could sense their unease, could feel the weight of their unspoken fears. Evelyn made her way to the town square, where the statue of Blackwood's founder stood tall and imposing. The statue, usually a symbol of the town's pride, now seemed to cast a shadow over the square, its stone features cold and unforgiving. Evelyn paused before it, her eyes tracing the lines of the statue's face, wondering what the founder would think of the darkness that had seeped into his town. As she stood there, a strange sensation washed over her. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, become more oppressive. The shadows cast by the statue seemed to lengthen, stretching toward her as if reaching for her soul. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, and she took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned and hurried away from the square, her footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, grew stronger with each passing moment. She could feel eyes on her, though she knew no one was there. The sensation was suffocating, and she quickened her pace, desperate to escape the unseen force that seemed to be closing in on her. Evelyn's path led her to the outskirts of Blackwood, to the edge of the forest where the battle had taken place. The trees loomed tall and silent, their branches tangled like the fingers of a giant, waiting to snatch her away. The forest floor was littered with fallen leaves, their dry rustle the only sound in the stillness. Evelyn hesitated at the tree line, her instinct screaming at her to turn back, to leave the forest behind and never return. But something deeper, something primal, pulled her forward. She stepped into the woods, her feet crunching on the leaves, her breath visible in the cold air. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees forming a canopy that blocked out the weak sunlight. The path she had walked so many times before now felt unfamiliar, as if the forest had shifted in her absence, becoming a place of shadows and secrets. Evelyn moved carefully through the woods, her senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch, made her heart race. She knew the forest well, but now it felt like a stranger, a place that had changed in some fundamental way. The trees, once familiar and comforting, now seemed twisted and malevolent, their trunks gnarled and their branches clawing at the sky. As she neared the clearing where the altar had stood, Evelyn's steps faltered. The memory of that night, of the battle she had fought, came rushing back with a force that nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. She could still see the shadowy entity, still feel the cold, crushing fear that had gripped her as she faced it. The clearing itself seemed different now, as if the very ground had absorbed the darkness, holding it in a deathly grip. The altar was gone, reduced to rubble and scattered stones. But the ground where it had stood was marked by a deep scar, a jagged fissure that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. Evelyn approached cautiously, her eyes fixed on the scar in the earth. The air around it felt charged, crackling with an energy that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Kneeling beside the fissure, Evelyn reached out to touch the ground, her fingers brushing the cold, hard earth. The moment she made contact, a shock of energy shot through her, sending a jolt of pain up her arm. She gasped, pulling back her hand, but the sensation lingered, a burning cold that seemed to spread through her entire body. Evelyn's heart raced as she tried to make sense of what she had felt. The scar in the earth was not just a mark. It was a wound, something deep and festering that had been left behind by the battle. The darkness that had been driven away had not been destroyed. It had merely retreated, burrowing deep into the earth, waiting for its moment to rise again. Evelyn stood, her mind racing. She had thought the battle was over, but now she realized that it had only just begun. The darkness was still here, lurking beneath the surface, and it was growing stronger. The entity she had faced had been a harbinger, a warning of something far more powerful and ancient that was stirring beneath Blackwood. As she walked back through the forest, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting and writhing like living things. The trees whispered in a language she couldn't understand, their branches swaying in a rhythm that felt almost alive. Evelyn quickened her pace, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She could feel the forest closing in around her, could sense the darkness following her, growing stronger with each step she took. It was as if the very ground beneath her feet was trying to pull her down, to drag her into the depths where the darkness waited. By the time she reached the edge of the forest, Evelyn was nearly running. She burst out into the open, the sudden light of day almost blinding her. She paused, catching her breath, and looked back at the forest. The trees stood silent and unmoving, but she knew better. The darkness was there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike again. Evelyn turned and hurried back to her house, her mind racing. She had to find a way to stop the darkness before it consumed Blackwood entirely. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The entity she had faced was just the beginning. Something far more powerful and malevolent was coming, and Evelyn knew that she would have to be ready to face it. As she entered her house, Evelyn felt a chill settle over her. The silence was oppressive, the air thick with an unseen tension. She locked the door behind her, her hands trembling, and leaned against it, trying to steady her breathing. The darkness was coming, and she had no idea how to stop it. The town of Blackwood might have returned to its routine, but Evelyn knew that the true terror had only just begun. Chapter 5. The Relentless Pursuit. As the days wore on, the sense of impending doom grew stronger. Blackwood, once a quiet town, now seemed cloaked in an invisible shroud of dread. The townspeople carried on with their lives, but their faces were etched with unease, their steps quicker, as if hurrying to escape something they couldn't quite name. The birds no longer sang in the mornings, and the nights grew longer, the darkness more suffocating. Evelyn spent her days preparing. She didn't know what was coming, but she felt its approach, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside her window, sent her heart racing. The house, her sanctuary, had become a place of tension, each shadow seeming to harbor something malevolent. She found herself drawn to the old books she had inherited from her grandmother, dusty tomes filled with ancient knowledge. The words within them spoke of forgotten rituals, of forces older than time itself, and of battles waged in the shadows, far from the eyes of the world. Evelyn devoured the information, desperate to find something, anything, that could help her understand the darkness she had encountered. One evening, as she sat in her small living room, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making the whole house shudder. The fire in the hearth flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she felt the air grow colder, a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She rose from her chair, her eyes scanning the room, half expecting to see the darkness manifest before her. But the room was empty, save for the flickering flames and the howling wind outside. Evelyn tried to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to her, but it was no use. She knew that something was out there, something that had not given up its claim on Blackwood. The night stretched on, the wind howling like a tortured soul. Evelyn paced the floor, unable to sit still, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. She couldn't sleep, not with the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. Instead, she gathered supplies: candles, salt, herbs, anything that might offer some protection against the encroaching darkness. As midnight approached, the wind died down, leaving the house in an eerie, unnatural silence. Evelyn paused in her preparations, listening intently. The silence was absolute, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. She moved to the window and peered out into the night. The town was dark, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and twist as if alive. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she saw something move at the edge of her vision. A shadow, darker than the night itself, flitted across the street, disappearing into an alley. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to see more, but the shadow was gone, swallowed by the darkness. She turned away from the window, her hands trembling. She knew that the shadow was not a trick of the light, not a figment of her imagination. It was real, and it was coming for her. The hours dragged on, the silence in the house growing more oppressive with each passing moment. Evelyn could feel the darkness creeping closer, could sense its malevolent presence just beyond the walls of her home. She lit more candles, their flickering flames casting a dim, wavering light that did little to chase away the shadows. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Evelyn felt a momentary relief. The darkness seemed to retreat, the oppressive weight lifting just slightly. But she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The entity had not been defeated. It was merely biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Evelyn's exhaustion finally caught up with her, and she collapsed into her bed, her body heavy with fatigue. But even in sleep, she found no peace. Her dreams were filled with visions of the shadowy figure, of the darkness seeping into every corner of Blackwood, consuming everything in its path. She saw the town, twisted and distorted, a place of nightmares where the sun never rose and the shadows reigned supreme. She woke with a start, the morning light filtering weakly through the curtains. The sense of dread lingered, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn knew she had to act, had to find a way to stop the darkness before it was too late. But where could she start? The books offered fragments of knowledge, hints of what might come, but nothing concrete, nothing that would lead her to a solution. She spent the day searching, poring over the ancient texts, trying to piece together the puzzle. The words seemed to blur on the page, her exhaustion making it difficult to focus. But she pressed on, driven by the gnawing fear that time was running out. As evening approached, Evelyn felt a strange pull, an instinct that she couldn't ignore. It led her back to the forest, to the place where the altar had stood. The air was thick with tension as she made her way through the trees, the forest eerily silent, as if holding its breath. The clearing was just as she had left it, the scar in the earth still pulsing with that faint, eerie light. But something was different now. The air around the fissure seemed to hum with energy, a low, vibrating sound that resonated deep within her. Evelyn knelt beside the scar, her fingers hovering above it, hesitant to touch the ground again. She could feel the darkness pulsing beneath the surface, a malevolent force that was growing stronger with each passing moment. It was waiting, gathering power, preparing to rise and consume everything in its path. Evelyn's mind raced as she tried to think of what to do. She had no weapons, no spells, nothing that could stop the darkness. But she knew she couldn't walk away, couldn't leave Blackwood to its fate. She had to find a way, had to do something before it was too late. She reached into her bag and pulled out the items she had brought with her, candles, salt, and the herbs she had gathered. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Evelyn set to work, creating a circle of protection around the fissure, hoping it would be enough to hold the darkness at bay. As she worked, the light in the clearing began to fade, the shadows growing longer, darker. The air grew colder, the hum of energy growing louder, more insistent. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she hurried to complete the circle, the sense of urgency pressing down on her. Finally, she stood back, surveying her work. The circle was complete, the candles flickering softly in the growing darkness. But would it be enough? Evelyn didn't know. She could only hope. As night fell, the clearing was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the candles. Evelyn stood at the edge of the circle, her eyes fixed on the scar in the earth. She could feel the darkness rising, could sense its malevolent presence just beneath the surface. It was close now, so close she could almost taste it. And then, without warning, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The scar in the earth pulsed with a blinding light, the energy within it surging upward, pushing against the circle of protection. The candles flickered wildly, their flames dancing in the wind that had suddenly picked up. Evelyn's heart raced as she watched the fissure widen, the light within it growing brighter, more intense. She could feel the darkness pressing against the circle, testing its strength, searching for a way out. For a moment, it seemed as if the circle would hold. But then, with a deafening crack, the earth split open, the circle of protection shattering as the darkness surged upward, free at last. Evelyn stumbled back, her eyes wide with fear as the darkness poured out of the fissure, a swirling mass of shadow and malevolence. It rose above the trees, towering over the forest, a living nightmare that seemed to consume the very light around it. The darkness moved with purpose, its form shifting and writhing as it flowed toward Evelyn. She could feel its cold, clammy touch as it reached out for her, could sense its hunger, its desire to consume her, to drag her down into the abyss. Evelyn turned and ran, her feet pounding against the forest floor as she fled from the clearing. The darkness followed, relentless in its pursuit, its form shifting and changing as it closed in on her. The trees blurred past her as she ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the darkness gaining on her, could sense its cold presence just behind her, reaching for her, trying to pull her down. But Evelyn didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She had to get back to Blackwood, had to warn the others, had to find a way to stop the darkness before it was too late. As she burst out of the forest, the town of Blackwood came into view, the lights of the houses flickering in the distance. But the darkness was close now, so close she could almost feel its breath on her neck. Evelyn pushed herself harder, her legs burning with the effort, her lungs screaming for air. She had to make it, had to reach the town, had to find a way to stop the darkness before it consumed everything. The streets of Blackwood were empty as she ran through them, the town eerily silent, the darkness looming just behind her. Evelyn could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, could sense its hunger, its desire to consume everything in its path. Finally, she reached her house, bursting through the door and slamming it shut behind her. She leaned against the door, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. But even in the safety of her home, Evelyn knew that the darkness was not done with her. It was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. And she knew that when it did, there would be no escaping it. The battle was far from over. The darkness had been unleashed, and Evelyn knew that she was the only one who could stop it. But how? How could she fight something so powerful, so malevolent, with nothing but candles and salt? As she stood there, catching her breath, Evelyn felt a cold chill settle over her. The darkness was coming, and this time, it would not be stopped. Chapter 6: The Gathering Storm. Evelyn awoke to the sound of distant thunder rumbling through the skies, the vibrations rattling the windows of her small house. The air was thick and heavy, as if the atmosphere itself was burdened by the weight of something unseen. She sat up in bed, her heart already pounding with a sense of foreboding. The events of the previous night were etched in her mind like a scar, the darkness that had pursued her still lingering in her thoughts, a relentless presence she couldn't shake. The morning light was muted, the sky overcast with thick, dark clouds that seemed to swallow the sun. The birds, usually chirping outside her window at this hour, were silent. The world outside felt unnaturally still, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Evelyn rose from her bed, her movements slow and deliberate, as if each step was weighted down by the gravity of the situation. She moved through the house, gathering her supplies with a mechanical efficiency. The candles she had placed around the house were burned down to stubs, their once bright flames reduced to faint, sputtering embers. Evelyn extinguished the last of them, feeling an irrational sense of loss as the last flicker of light was snuffed out. She replaced them with fresh candles, lighting each one carefully, their small flames offering a brief reprieve from the overwhelming darkness she felt pressing in on her. As she worked, Evelyn's thoughts drifted back to the clearing in the forest, to the fissure in the earth that had unleashed the malevolent force she now faced. The ancient texts she had pored over in desperation had offered little comfort. The rituals and spells described within their pages seemed woefully inadequate against the sheer power of the darkness that had emerged. But Evelyn knew she had no choice. She had to fight, to find a way to stop it before it consumed everything in its path. The wind outside began to pick up, howling through the trees with an eerie, mournful wail. Evelyn shivered as she felt the chill seep into the house, the temperature dropping rapidly. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, but it did little to ward off the cold that seemed to emanate from within her very soul. The house, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt like a prison, each room filled with an oppressive sense of dread. Evelyn made her way to the small kitchen, where she brewed a pot of tea, her hands trembling as she poured the hot liquid into a cup. She sipped it slowly, the warmth spreading through her body, but it did little to calm the fear gnawing at her insides. The storm outside grew louder, the wind whipping through the trees with increasing ferocity. The sky had darkened further, the clouds now a deep, ominous shade of gray that seemed to mirror the darkness within Evelyn's mind. As the day wore on, the storm intensified. Rain began to fall, a torrential downpour that battered against the windows, the sound a relentless drumbeat that echoed through the house. The trees outside bent under the force of the wind, their branches scraping against the roof with a screeching sound that set Evelyn's teeth on edge. She paced the floor, her anxiety growing with each passing hour, the storm outside a reflection of the turmoil within her. Evelyn tried to focus on her preparations, but her mind kept drifting back to the darkness, to the way it had moved, shifting and writhing like a living thing, its presence overwhelming in its intensity. She could still feel it, a malevolent force that seemed to seep into every corner of her consciousness, an ever-present threat that refused to be ignored. The storm outside was a manifestation of that darkness. She was sure of it, a physical representation of the battle that was about to unfold. As the afternoon turned to evening, the storm reached its peak. The wind howled with a fury that seemed almost sentient, the rain lashing against the house with a violence that shook the very foundations. The sky was now a deep, inky black, the clouds so thick that they blotted out any trace of light. Evelyn lit more candles, their flames flickering wildly in the gusts of wind that found their way through the cracks in the windows and doors. The house was filled with the dim, wavering light, the shadows dancing on the walls like spectral figures. Evelyn knew that the time was drawing near. She could feel the darkness gathering strength, could sense it coalescing into something more tangible, more dangerous. The storm was just the beginning, a herald of what was to come. She could feel it in her bones, a deep, instinctual knowledge that something terrible was about to happen. She moved to the living room, where she had set up her makeshift altar. The books lay open on the table, the pages filled with ancient symbols and incantations. Evelyn had spent hours studying them, memorizing the words, the gestures, the rituals that might offer some protection. But as she stood there, staring down at the arcane symbols, doubt crept into her mind. What if it wasn't enough? What if the darkness was too strong, too powerful to be contained by the knowledge of the ancients? The thought sent a shiver of fear down her spine, but she pushed it aside. She had come too far to give up now. She had to try, had to fight with everything she had. Evelyn began to prepare the ritual, her movements precise, each action deliberate and measured. She placed the candles in a circle, their flames casting a protective barrier of light around the altar. She sprinkled salt around the perimeter, the grains glinting in the candlelight, a fragile line of defense against the encroaching darkness. As she worked, the storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling with an almost inhuman intensity. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of noise that reverberated through the house, making the walls tremble. The air was thick with tension, the pressure building to an almost unbearable level. Evelyn could feel it in her chest, a tightness that made it difficult to breathe, as if the very air was being sucked out of the room. She lit the final candle and stepped back, surveying her work. The altar was complete, the ritual ready to begin. But as she stood there, staring at the flickering flames, a sense of hopelessness washed over her. The storm was growing stronger by the minute, the darkness outside pressing in on the house with a relentless force. Evelyn knew that it was only a matter of time before it broke through, before the protective circle she had created was shattered by the sheer power of the malevolent force that sought to consume her. But she had no choice. She had to go through with the ritual, had to try and hold the darkness at bay, even if only for a little while longer. Evelyn took a deep breath, steadying herself, and began to chant the incantation, her voice low and steady, the ancient words rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. The candles flickered as she spoke, the flames dancing in response to the power of the words. The air around her seemed to hum with energy, a low, vibrating sound that resonated deep within her. As she continued the chant, the storm outside seemed to reach a crescendo, the wind howling with a fury that shook the very foundations of the house. The rain pounded against the windows, the sound almost deafening. But Evelyn didn't falter. She repeated the incantation over and over, her voice growing stronger, more confident with each repetition. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the air crackling with the power of the ritual. For a moment, it seemed as if the storm outside was receding, the wind dying down, the rain lessening. Evelyn felt a surge of hope, a brief flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. But it was short-lived. A sudden, violent gust of wind shattered one of the windows, sending shards of glass flying across the room. The candles flickered wildly, their flames guttering in the sudden rush of air. Evelyn's heart raced as she felt the darkness surge forward, pushing against the protective circle she had created. The candles sputtered, their flames nearly extinguished by the force of the wind. The air was filled with the sound of the storm, the howling wind, the pounding rain, the creaking of the house as it strained under the pressure. But beneath it all, Evelyn could hear something else, a low, malevolent whisper, a voice that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. The darkness was here. It had found a way in. Evelyn's mind raced as she tried to think of what to do. The ritual was failing, the protective circle crumbling under the sheer force of the darkness. The storm outside was a manifestation of its power, a physical representation of the battle that was about to unfold. But Evelyn knew that she couldn't give up. She had to find a way to stop it, to hold the darkness at bay long enough to figure out how to defeat it. With a trembling hand, she reached for the book, flipping through the pages, searching for something, anything that could help her. The words blurred on the page, her exhaustion and fear making it difficult to focus. But Evelyn forced herself to keep reading, to keep searching for a solution. The darkness was closing in, the air in the room growing colder, more oppressive. The candles were nearly out, their flames reduced to small, flickering points of light that did little to chase away the shadows. Evelyn could feel the darkness pressing against her, could sense its malevolent presence just beyond the circle, waiting for the moment when the light would fail, when the barrier would be breached. She found the passage she was looking for, her eyes scanning the ancient text, the words offering a glimmer of hope. It was a binding spell, a powerful incantation that could trap the darkness, contain it long enough for her to find a more permanent solution. Evelyn's hands shook as she began to chant the words, her voice rising above the noise of the storm, the power of the incantation filling the room. The darkness seemed to hesitate, as if sensing the threat of the spell. Evelyn chanted louder, her voice steady and strong, the ancient words reverberating through the room. The air crackled with energy, the candles flaring to life as the power of the spell took hold. The darkness recoiled, retreating from the circle, the pressure in the room lessening as the spell pushed it back. But the storm outside was relentless, the wind howling with renewed fury, the rain lashing against the house with a vengeance. The darkness was fighting back, pushing against the barrier, trying to break through. Evelyn could feel it, could sense its anger, its desperation as it fought to escape the binding spell. The air was thick with tension, the energy in the room almost palpable as the battle between light and darkness raged on. Evelyn didn't falter. She continued to chant, her voice unwavering, the power of the spell growing with each word. The darkness writhed and twisted, its form shifting and changing as it struggled against the binding force of the spell. But Evelyn held firm, her will unyielding, her determination to stop the darkness stronger than her fear. Finally, with one last, desperate surge, the darkness pushed against the barrier, the force of its power nearly overwhelming. But Evelyn didn't give in. She poured every ounce of her strength into the spell, her voice rising to a crescendo as she spoke the final words of the incantation. The darkness let out a piercing, inhuman shriek, the sound reverberating through the house, shaking the very walls. And then, with a final, violent shudder, it was gone. The room fell silent, the air still and heavy, the storm outside suddenly quiet. The candles burned steadily, their flames bright and unwavering, the protective circle intact. Evelyn collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The battle was over, but she knew it was only a temporary victory. The darkness had been contained, but it was not defeated. It was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike again. And Evelyn knew that when it did, she would have to be ready. Chapter 7. The Eye of the Storm. The calm after the storm was unsettling in its own way. The sudden silence was a stark contrast to the cacophony that had filled the night, leaving Evelyn disoriented and unnerved. The wind had died down, the rain reduced to a light drizzle, and the oppressive clouds that had loomed overhead were beginning to break apart, allowing slivers of moonlight to filter through. The house, though battered and bruised, now felt eerily quiet, as if holding its breath in the aftermath of the violence it had endured. Evelyn moved cautiously through the house, her steps tentative as she assessed the damage. The broken window in the living room was the most immediate concern. She gingerly picked up the shards of glass, the jagged pieces crunching under her gloves as she swept them into a dustpan. The broken glass was a stark reminder of the power of the force she had faced, a tangible representation of the danger that still lurked just beyond her reach. The candles, though still burning, had burned down to stubs, their light flickering weakly in the dim room. Evelyn replaced them with fresh ones, their flames casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. The protective circle she had created earlier still held, the salt and candles forming a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. But Evelyn knew that it was not a permanent solution. The darkness had been contained, but it had not been vanquished, and the storm had left her feeling more vulnerable than ever. She moved to the kitchen, where the kettle was still warm from the tea she had brewed earlier. The steam rising from the spout was a comforting sight, and she poured herself a cup of hot tea, hoping the warmth would help steady her nerves. As she sipped the tea, she stared out the kitchen window at the night sky, now clear and sprinkled with stars. The calm after the storm was beautiful in its own way, but it also felt like a deceptive tranquility, a temporary reprieve before the inevitable return of the darkness. Evelyn's mind was still reeling from the events of the past few hours. The storm had been more than just a natural occurrence. It had been a manifestation of the darkness's power, a physical representation of the malevolent force that had been unleashed. The storm had raged with a fury that seemed almost sentient, its howling winds and pounding rain a direct reflection of the darkness's wrath. She moved to her study, a small room filled with books and ancient texts. The room was a sanctuary, a place where she could immerse herself in the knowledge she needed to fight the darkness. The books, though old and worn, were a source of solace, their pages filled with spells, rituals, and incantations that might hold the key to defeating the malevolent force that plagued her. Evelyn set to work, her fingers tracing the lines of the ancient texts as she searched for anything that might help her understand the nature of the darkness. The books were filled with arcane symbols and cryptic passages, their meaning often obscured by the passage of time. She pored over the pages, her eyes scanning the text for any clue, any hint that might offer a solution. As she read, she could feel the weight of exhaustion settling over her. The night had taken its toll, leaving her drained and weary. She forced herself to stay focused, knowing that she could not afford to let her guard down. The darkness was still out there, its presence a constant threat, and she had to find a way to stop it before it could strike again. The hours ticked by, the moonlight casting long shadows across the room as Evelyn continued her research. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling as the temperature dropped. The warmth of the tea had long faded, leaving Evelyn feeling chilled and fatigued. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, the soft fabric a small comfort against the cold that had seeped into the room. As dawn approached, Evelyn's eyes grew heavy with fatigue. The books lay open before her, their pages filled with arcane knowledge that offered little solace. The ancient texts spoke of powerful rituals and binding spells, but they were often vague, their instructions unclear. Evelyn knew that she needed to find a way to translate the knowledge into something actionable, something that could effectively combat the darkness that threatened her. She finally closed the last of the books, her mind numb with exhaustion. The morning light began to filter through the windows, the first rays of sunlight casting a pale glow over the room. The storm had passed, but the sense of unease remained. a lingering reminder of the danger that still lurked in the shadows. Evelyn moved through the house, her steps slow and deliberate as she checked each room. The damage from the storm was extensive, but it was manageable. She repaired the broken window with a piece of cardboard, securing it with tape until she could get a proper replacement. The other rooms were in disarray, but nothing that couldn't be cleaned up. As she worked, Evelyn's thoughts turned to the forest clearing where the darkness had first been unleashed. The fissure in the earth had been a source of great power, a conduit for the malevolent force that had followed her home. She knew that she needed to return to the clearing, to investigate the source of the darkness and find a way to close the rift. The thought of returning to the clearing filled her with a sense of dread, but she knew that it was necessary. The darkness had been contained, but it was still a threat, and she needed to understand its origins if she hoped to defeat it. The clearing was a place of great danger, but it was also the key to unraveling the mystery of the darkness. Evelyn prepared for her journey, gathering her supplies and ensuring that she had everything she needed. She packed candles, salt, and other ritual items, as well as a first aid kit and a flashlight. She knew that the forest was unpredictable, and she wanted to be prepared for any eventuality. As she stepped outside, the morning air was crisp and cool, a refreshing change from the oppressive heat of the previous night. The sun was shining, casting a warm glow over the landscape, but Evelyn's anxiety remained. The forest was a place of mystery and danger, and she had to be cautious. She made her way to the edge of the forest, her steps slow and deliberate as she approached the clearing. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The clearing itself was shrouded in shadows, the remnants of the storm still visible in the scattered debris and broken branches. Evelyn moved carefully into the clearing, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of the darkness. The fissure in the earth was still there, a gaping wound in the ground that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The sight of it filled her with a sense of foreboding, a reminder of the power that lay beneath. She set up her ritual items around the fissure, the candles forming a protective circle, the salt creating a barrier against the darkness. As she worked, she could feel the tension in the air, a palpable sense of unease that seemed to emanate from the fissure itself. The darkness was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for its chance to break free. Evelyn completed her preparations and began the ritual, her movements precise and deliberate as she performed the incantation. The candles flickered, their flames casting long shadows on the ground, and the air around her seemed to hum with energy. She chanted the words of the spell, her voice steady and strong, the power of the ritual filling the clearing. The fissure began to tremble, the ground vibrating with a low, rumbling sound. Evelyn could feel the darkness reacting to the ritual, its malevolent presence pushing against the barrier she had created. The energy in the clearing was intense, the air crackling with the power of the spell. Evelyn continued the ritual, her focus unwavering as she fought to keep the darkness at bay. The fissure seemed to shrink, the malevolent energy retreating as the power of the spell took hold. The air grew still, the tension easing as the darkness was pushed back. Finally, with a final, intense burst of energy, the fissure closed, the ground settling into place. The darkness had been contained, the malevolent force pushed back into the earth. Evelyn stood in the clearing, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. She knew that the battle was not over, that the darkness would continue to seek a way to escape. But for now, she had succeeded in closing the rift, in stopping the immediate threat. The clearing was still and quiet, the air calm and peaceful once more. Evelyn gathered her supplies and made her way back to the house, her steps slow and deliberate. The journey had been arduous, but she had achieved her goal. As she approached her home, she could feel the weight of the past few days lifting, a sense of relief washing over her. But she knew that she could not rest for long. The darkness was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike again. Evelyn would have to remain vigilant, to continue her fight against the malevolent force that threatened her. The battle was far from over, and she had to be ready for whatever came next. Chapter 8. The Return of the Shadows. The days following Evelyn's confrontation with the darkness were marked by a fragile calm. The clearing, once a source of fear and trepidation, was now a place of tentative peace. The fissure had been sealed, but Evelyn knew that the darkness was not defeated, merely postponed. She spent her days in a state of heightened vigilance, her senses attuned to any signs of the malevolent force that had once threatened her. Her home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battleground. The air was thick with an uneasy stillness, and Evelyn's nights were filled with restless sleep, plagued by dreams of shadowy figures and eerie whispers. The darkness seemed to have retreated, but its presence lingered, a constant reminder of the danger that still lurked. Evelyn's research into the ancient texts continued, her focus unwavering as she searched for any clue that might help her understand the nature of the darkness. The books were filled with arcane symbols and cryptic passages, their meaning often elusive. She spent hours poring over the texts, her mind growing weary from the effort. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, Evelyn was startled by a sudden chill that swept through the house. The temperature dropped precipitously, and a gust of wind blew through the open window, extinguishing the candles that had been burning steadily. The room was plunged into darkness, and Evelyn's heart raced as she struggled to light a new candle. The darkness seemed to press in on her, its presence oppressive and suffocating. Evelyn could feel the malevolent force gathering strength, its power growing with each passing moment. She fumbled with the matches, her hands shaking as she tried to light the candle. The flame flickered to life, casting a weak glow over the room, but the sense of unease remained. The wind howled outside, and the rain began to fall again, a relentless downpour that seemed to mirror the turmoil within Evelyn's heart. She moved through the house, checking the windows and doors to ensure that they were secure. The storm outside was growing in intensity, the thunder rumbling ominously in the distance. Evelyn's thoughts turned to the clearing and the fissure she had sealed. She wondered if the darkness had found a new way to reach her, if the storm was a manifestation of the malevolent force that was still at large. The sense of dread was palpable, a heavy weight that settled over her shoulders. As she made her way to her study, the feeling of being watched intensified. Evelyn glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The darkness seemed to be closing in, its presence a constant and oppressive force. She tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on her research, but the sense of foreboding remained. The study was filled with the soft glow of the candles, their light casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. Evelyn opened her books and began to read, her eyes skimming the pages for any hint of a solution. The text spoke of ancient rituals and powerful spells, but they offered little in the way of practical advice. As the night wore on, the storm outside grew louder, the wind howling with an eerie intensity. Evelyn's nerves were frayed, her mind growing weary from the effort of staying alert. She forced herself to continue her research, her focus unwavering despite the mounting tension. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house, startling Evelyn. The sound came from the attic, a place she had not ventured since the darkness had first appeared. Her heart raced as she made her way to the attic, the creaking stairs and the howling wind adding to the sense of foreboding. The attic was cluttered with old furniture and forgotten belongings, the dust-covered surfaces a testament to years of neglect. Evelyn moved cautiously through the attic, her flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The sense of unease grew stronger, and she could feel the darkness lingering just beyond her reach. As she reached the far end of the attic, she noticed something strange. A small, dusty box sat on a high shelf, its surface covered in cobwebs. Evelyn reached for the box, her fingers trembling as she pulled it down. The box was old and worn, its hinges rusty from years of disuse. With a deep breath, Evelyn opened the box. Inside, she found an assortment of items, old photographs, yellowed letters, and a small, ornate box that was intricately carved. The photographs depicted scenes of a bygone era, people dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their expressions serious and solemn. The letters were filled with cryptic messages and strange symbols, their meaning unclear. Evelyn's eyes were drawn to the ornate box, its intricate carvings depicting strange and arcane symbols. She carefully opened it, revealing a small, black amulet nestled inside. The amulet was cold to the touch, its surface smooth and polished. Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine as she held it in her hand. The amulet seemed to pulse with a faint, ominous energy, its presence a stark reminder of the darkness that still threatened her. Evelyn examined the amulet closely, her mind racing as she tried to decipher its significance. The symbols carved into its surface were unfamiliar, their meaning obscured by the passage of time. As she continued to study the amulet, the storm outside grew more intense, the wind howling and the rain lashing against the windows. The power of the storm seemed to mirror the malevolent energy emanating from the amulet, a reflection of the darkness that still lingered. Evelyn's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, loud banging sound coming from the floor below. She quickly gathered the items from the box, carefully placing them back in their original positions. With a sense of urgency, she descended the stairs, the storm's fury matching the turmoil within her heart. The house was eerily silent as she moved from room to room, checking for any signs of disturbance. The darkness seemed to be closing in, its presence suffocating and oppressive. Evelyn could feel the malevolent force growing stronger, its power increasing with each passing moment. As she reached the living room, she noticed that the candles she had lit earlier were flickering weakly, their flames casting long shadows on the walls. The room was filled with an uneasy stillness, the air heavy with a sense of impending danger. Evelyn's eyes were drawn to the center of the room, where a small, dark shape lay on the floor. She approached cautiously, her heart racing as she reached for the object. It was the same small, black amulet she had found in the attic, its surface cold and smooth. The amulet was now lying on the floor, its presence a stark reminder of the darkness that still threatened her. Evelyn picked it up, her fingers trembling as she examined it. The amulet seemed to pulse with an ominous energy, its power a tangible force that filled the room. As Evelyn held the amulet, she felt a sudden, intense chill that swept through the room. The temperature dropped precipitously, and the wind howled outside, its fury matching the sense of dread that filled her heart. The darkness seemed to be closing in, its presence a constant and oppressive force. Evelyn knew that she had to act quickly. The darkness was growing stronger, its power increasing with each passing moment. She needed to find a way to counteract its influence, to protect herself from the malevolent force that threatened her. With a sense of determination, Evelyn returned to her study, the amulet clutched tightly in her hand. She opened the ancient texts, searching for any clue that might help her understand the significance of the amulet and how to counteract its power. The storm outside continued to rage, its fury a reflection of the darkness that still lurked. As she pored over the texts, Evelyn felt a sense of urgency growing within her. The darkness was closing in, its presence a constant reminder of the danger that still threatened her. She had to find a way to protect herself, to stop the malevolent force before it could overpower her. The night wore on, the storm outside showing no signs of abating. Evelyn's eyes were tired, her mind weary from the effort of staying alert. The candles burned low, their flames flickering weakly in the dim light. But Evelyn's determination remained steadfast, her resolve to confront the darkness unshaken. The amulet's power was a constant presence, its malevolent energy a reminder of the danger that still lurked. Evelyn knew that she had to be prepared for whatever came next, to continue her fight against the darkness that threatened her. The battle was far from over, and she had to be ready for the challenges that lay ahead. As dawn approached, Evelyn finally closed the ancient texts, her mind still racing with questions and concerns. The storm outside had begun to subside, the wind's howling reduced to a faint whisper. The first rays of sunlight began to filter through the windows, casting a pale glow over the room. Evelyn took a deep breath, her heart still racing from the events of the night. The darkness had been contained, but its presence remained a constant threat. She knew that she had to remain vigilant, to continue her fight against the malevolent force that still lurked in the shadows. With a sense of determination, Evelyn prepared for the day ahead. She knew that the battle was far from over, that the darkness would continue to seek a way to break free. But she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, her resolve to protect herself and her home unwavering. Chapter 9. The Unseen Force. The dawn light filtered softly through the windows of Evelyn's home, casting a serene glow over the now damp landscape. The storm had subsided, leaving behind a world washed clean but still heavy with the aftermath of the violence it had unleashed. Evelyn awoke early, her body sore from the restless night, but her mind sharp and focused on the task at hand. She moved through her home with a sense of purpose, her thoughts consumed by the mysterious amulet she had found in the attic. The sense of foreboding it carried was palpable, its dark energy a stark contrast to the tranquility of the morning. Evelyn knew she needed to understand the amulet's significance and how it tied into the darkness she had been fighting. In the study, Evelyn laid out the contents of the dusty box she had discovered. The photographs, letters, and amulet were arranged meticulously on the desk. She began with the photographs, examining each one closely. The images depicted various people in what seemed to be historical settings. Some were dressed in attire from centuries past, others looked like they belonged to a more recent era, but all bore expressions of grave concern. The photographs had an unsettling quality, as though they were capturing moments of fear or distress. The letters were equally enigmatic. Their ink had faded with time, making the writing difficult to decipher. Evelyn carefully transcribed the text into her notebook, hoping to glean any useful information. The letters contained strange symbols and references to events that were unclear, but they hinted at rituals and ancient rites that had been practiced long ago. The more Evelyn read, the more she felt a sense of connection between the letters and the darkness she had encountered. The amulet was the focal point of her concern. Its intricate carvings were both mesmerizing and disturbing. Evelyn set it in the center of her desk, surrounded by the texts and artifacts she had been studying. She examined the amulet from every angle, its cold surface and the faint energy it emitted only deepening her anxiety. Its symbols were unlike anything she had seen before, and its significance remained a mystery. As she continued her investigation, Evelyn began to notice subtle changes in her surroundings. The air grew colder, and shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. The once comforting light of the candles now felt ominous, their flickering flames casting unsettling shapes on the walls. Evelyn tried to ignore the growing sense of unease, focusing instead on her research. In the midst of her study, Evelyn decided to revisit the clearing in the forest. She needed to examine the site of the fissure once more, to ensure that it had remained sealed and to gather more information about the darkness that had been unleashed. She prepared a bag with necessary supplies, salt, candles, protective charms, and her notebook. The early afternoon light provided a brief respite from the storm's aftermath, making it a suitable time for her visit. Evelyn ventured into the forest, her steps cautious and deliberate. The trees, still damp from the rain, glistened in the sunlight. The air was fresh, but the forest seemed to hold its breath, the silence a stark contrast to the storm's fury. The clearing came into view, its appearance markedly different from the chaos Evelyn had witnessed before. The fissure was closed, its jagged edges now smooth and unremarkable. The dark energy that had once permeated the site seemed to have dissipated, but Evelyn knew better than to let her guard down. She walked around the perimeter of the clearing, examining the area for any signs of disturbance. The ground was muddy, the remnants of the storm still visible in the scattered debris. Evelyn carefully noted her observations in her notebook, documenting every detail. She set up her ritual items around the clearing once more, creating a protective circle to ensure her safety as she conducted her examination. As she worked, Evelyn could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. The sensation was subtle, a creeping sense of being observed from the shadows. She glanced around the clearing, her eyes scanning the surrounding forest, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The feeling persisted, however, a constant undercurrent of dread that seemed to follow her every move. With her examination complete, Evelyn packed up her supplies and prepared to leave the clearing. As she turned to go, she noticed something unusual, a small, dark shape lying in the grass near the edge of the clearing. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The object was an old, leather-bound book, its cover worn and faded. Evelyn picked it up, its weight surprising her. The book seemed to hum with a faint energy, its presence both intriguing and unsettling. She opened the book, revealing pages filled with handwritten text and strange symbols. The handwriting was old-fashioned, the ink faded but still legible. The contents appeared to be a journal or a ledger, detailing various rituals and observations. Evelyn's eyes skimmed over the text, her curiosity piqued by the references to dark entities and forbidden rites. The book seemed to offer a wealth of information, but it was also clear that it contained powerful and potentially dangerous knowledge. Evelyn decided to take it back to her study, where she could examine it more thoroughly. She tucked the book into her bag and began her journey back home, her mind racing with thoughts of the new discoveries she had made. As Evelyn walked through the forest, the sense of being watched grew stronger. The shadows seemed to lengthen and twist around her, the forest itself appearing to close in. She quickened her pace, her nerves on edge as she made her way through the trees. The feeling of dread was almost palpable, and she could sense that the darkness was not far behind. Returning to her home, Evelyn was relieved to be back in the safety of her sanctuary. She immediately set to work examining the book she had found, her hands trembling with anticipation. The journal detailed various rites and incantations, some of which were disturbingly familiar. The references to dark entities and forbidden knowledge were unsettling, but they also offered clues about the nature of the darkness she had been battling. The more Evelyn read, the clearer it became that the darkness was not an isolated phenomenon but part of a larger, more complex web of malevolent forces. The book spoke of ancient rites designed to summon and control these entities, and it became evident that the amulet she had found was likely a key to unlocking or controlling these dark forces. The evening drew near, and the atmosphere in Evelyn's home grew heavy with a sense of impending danger. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, its presence a constant reminder of the threat she faced. The book's revelations only deepened her sense of unease, and she could feel the malevolent energy that had been so elusive becoming more tangible. Evelyn knew that she had to continue her research to understand the full extent of the darkness and how to counteract it. The book was a vital piece of the puzzle, but it also posed a significant risk. The knowledge it contained was both powerful and perilous, and she had to handle it with extreme caution. As the night fell, Evelyn's home was illuminated by the flickering light of candles. The shadows danced on the walls, their movements eerie and unsettling. Evelyn continued her study, her focus unwavering despite the growing sense of dread. The darkness was still out there, lurking just beyond her reach, and she had to be prepared for whatever came next. The battle against the malevolent force was far from over, and Evelyn knew that she had to remain vigilant. The book, the amulet, and the rituals all pointed to a deeper, more complex threat. She had to unravel the mysteries of the darkness, to find a way to protect herself and her home from the unseen forces that sought to engulf her. With determination and resolve, Evelyn continued her research into the night. The darkness outside was a constant reminder of the danger that lurked, and she knew that she had to be ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The fight against the malevolent force was just beginning, and she had to be prepared to confront the shadows that threatened to consume her. Chapter 10. The Final Confrontation. The first light of dawn cast a faint, golden hue over Evelyn's home, but the atmosphere inside was anything but serene. The events of the past few days had left her on edge, her mind consumed by the threat that loomed over her. The book she had found in the forest and the amulet she had discovered in the attic were central to her concerns, their dark energy a persistent reminder of the danger she faced. Evelyn's study was cluttered with the remnants of her research, open books, scattered notes, and arcane symbols drawn in the margins. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, the shadows cast by the flickering candles dancing menacingly on the walls. The sense of urgency was palpable. She knew that the time for action had come. She sat at her desk, the dark amulet resting prominently before her. The intricate carvings seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent energy, a constant reminder of the darkness she had been fighting. The ancient book lay open beside it, its pages filled with cryptic rites and forbidden knowledge. Evelyn's fingers traced the symbols on the amulet, her expression one of grim determination. The storm from days prior had left the land in a state of disarray. Fallen branches and debris littered the landscape, and the once lush greenery was now damp and bedraggled. Evelyn's thoughts turned to the clearing in the forest, the site of the fissure that had once been a conduit for the darkness. She knew that she needed to return there, to face whatever remained of the malevolent force and put an end to it once and for all. She gathered her supplies, salt, protective charms, candles, and the book, and set out for the forest. The morning was eerily calm, the air heavy with an oppressive silence. The forest path was muddy and treacherous, the remnants of the storm making every step a challenge. Evelyn's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and resolve as she made her way to the clearing. The clearing was as she had left it, the fissure now sealed but the air still thick with an unsettling energy. Evelyn set up her ritual items with meticulous care, creating a protective circle around the site. The ritual was one she had studied extensively from the ancient book, designed to confront and banish malevolent entities. The symbols and incantations were complex, but Evelyn was determined to see it through. As she worked, the atmosphere around her grew heavier, the sense of being watched intensifying. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, the forest itself appearing to close in. The wind picked up, carrying with it an eerie chill that made Evelyn's breath visible in the cold air. The darkness was approaching, its presence palpable and foreboding. Evelyn completed the ritual preparations and lit the candles, their flickering flames casting a warm but eerie light over the clearing. She placed the amulet in the center of the protective circle, its dark energy a stark contrast to the soft glow of the candles. With a deep breath, she began the ritual, her movements precise and deliberate. The ancient book guided her through each step, the symbols and incantations etched into her memory. Evelyn chanted silently, her focus unwavering as she performed the ritual. The air around her seemed to vibrate with an unseen force, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The sense of dread grew stronger, but Evelyn remained resolute, her determination to confront the darkness unshaken. As the ritual progressed, the shadows around the clearing grew more distinct, their shapes coalescing into ominous forms. The dark energy seemed to swirl and writhe, reacting to the ritual with a malevolent intensity. Evelyn could feel the power of the darkness rising, its presence a tangible force that threatened to overwhelm her. The protective circle was holding, but the strain was evident. The amulet's energy pulsed rhythmically, its dark power a constant reminder of the force she was battling. Evelyn continued the ritual, her movements growing more urgent as the darkness pressed closer. The symbols she had drawn in the ground seemed to glow with a faint light, their protective power a fragile barrier against the encroaching malevolence. The wind howled through the trees, the storm's aftermath a reminder of the tumultuous battle taking place. The candles flickered wildly, their flames casting erratic shadows on the ground. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly, but she maintained her focus, determined to see the ritual through to its conclusion. The shadows around the clearing began to coalesce into more defined shapes, their forms dark and menacing. Evelyn's heart raced as she recognized the familiar presence of the darkness she had faced before. It was as though the malevolent force was taking physical form, its presence an overwhelming and oppressive force. The final steps of the ritual were the most critical. Evelyn had to concentrate all of her willpower and focus into the process, channeling the protective energy to banish the darkness once and for all. The symbols on the ground glowed brightly, their light pushing back against the encroaching shadows. The amulet's dark energy seemed to be in conflict with the ritual's protective power, creating a dramatic and intense struggle. As the ritual reached its climax, the darkness around the clearing began to writhe and twist violently. The malevolent force fought against the protective energy, its presence a chaotic and destructive force. Evelyn could feel the intensity of the battle, her own energy and determination being tested to their limits. The struggle seemed to go on for an eternity, the darkness and light locked in a fierce conflict. But slowly, the protective energy began to gain the upper hand. The shadows started to recede, their shapes losing definition and becoming indistinct. The dark energy that had once filled the clearing was now being pushed back, its power diminishing as the ritual took effect. Finally, with a burst of light and energy, the darkness was driven away. The clearing was bathed in a bright, warm light, the oppressive presence that had loomed over it vanishing completely. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, exhausted but triumphant. The ritual had succeeded. The darkness had been banished. The clearing was now peaceful, the shadows and malevolent energy gone. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight that had hung over Evelyn's shoulders lifting. She looked around the clearing, her heart filled with a sense of relief and accomplishment. The battle was over, and she had emerged victorious. Evelyn packed up her ritual items, her movements slow and deliberate as she gathered her things. The book and amulet were carefully placed back in her bag, their dark power no longer a threat. She took one last look at the clearing, the scene of her final confrontation with the darkness, and then began her journey back home. As she walked through the forest, the air felt different, clearer and more vibrant. The storm's aftermath had left the landscape fresh and renewed, and Evelyn could feel the change in the atmosphere. The forest, once a place of dread and fear, now seemed calm and serene. Returning to her home, Evelyn felt a profound sense of closure. The darkness that had threatened her and her world was gone, its power broken. She knew that the battle she had fought was significant, a test of her strength and resolve. The knowledge she had gained from the book and the amulet would stay with her, a reminder of the darkness she had faced and the light she had found. As the sun set, Evelyn sat in her study, the candles once again burning softly around her. The room was filled with a sense of peace, the shadows no longer ominous, but simply a part of the evening's natural light. She reflected on the events that had transpired, the challenges she had overcome, and the strength she had discovered within herself. The darkness was gone, but Evelyn knew that she would always remember the struggle and the lessons learned. She had faced the unknown and emerged victorious, a testament to her courage and determination. The future was uncertain, but for now, Evelyn could rest easy, knowing that she had triumphed over the malevolent force that had once threatened her world. With a final glance at the amulet and the book, Evelyn closed her study for the night. The shadows in the room were calm and familiar, no longer a source of fear but a reminder of the journey she had undertaken. She went to bed with a sense of peace, ready to face whatever new challenges might come her way.